The late environmentalist David Brower said, "Victories for the environment are always temporary, but defeats are always permanent." In Elizabeth May's case, she has had many environmental victories and a few defeats. But when it comes to politics, her political defeats are not so permanent. She is the first Green Party MP elected in Canada, an historic victory. She is also a writer, activist, lawyer, author, and the leader of the Green Party of Canada. It is my pleasure to welcome Elizabeth May back to Studio 4 to tell us more.
Good morning, Fanny.
What does this feel like?
Well, it certainly feels better than losing.
I was thinking.
It's a very different scenario what the Parliament's going to look like now with Mr. Harper's party having more seats than anyone else, so it's got a majority. Although it had a minority of the popular vote, that's a majority Parliament in our first past the post system. And as the only elected Green Party member of Parliament, I have quite a job to do because my primary obligation is to the voters of Saanich-Gulf Islands, and they're the ones who made history.
Mm-hmm. They sure did. All 2,000 of those volunteers.
Yeah,
or something like that. You had an amazing number.
We had an amazing, I was thinking about the other day, we had actually 2,500 volunteers. It used to be that we used to get 2,500 votes. We had 32,000 votes almost, and the work of so many volunteers, and of all ages. We unleashed senior power like you wouldn't believe. Retirees who showed up every day, knocking on doors, working in our office, right down to high school kids who couldn't vote yet.
I recall someone saying to you, "Why would you run there? They're mostly seniors."
Yeah, yeah, but that means lots of life experience, lots of people who've worked in government, lots of public policy knowledge, and really unleashing that because they really wanted to change democracy and improve democracy in Canada.
Well, as you pointed out, seniors still rock.
Yeah, well, Bill Henderson from Chilliwack, he didn't mind that I referred to him as a rocking seniors. And Randy Bachman, it was really great. Bill Henderson, Randy Bachman, and Sharon Ulrich recorded a theme song for me that they made up, which is, you can find it on YouTube. It's really great.
Okay, and Valdi was there too, I'm sure.
Valdi was there too.
Nellie Furtado endorsed you from the get-go. I was reading that, and Margaret Atwood said it's very important, and her husband Graham Gibson said it's very important we elect a Green. And Wade Davis, one of my heroes, really, ethnobotanist, fantastic, endorsed you.
Yeah, we had a lot of incredible sort of, prominent Canadians who said, we think it's time to get a different voice in Parliament. And then a lot of the voters in Saanich-Gulf Islands said, we think it's time to get respect back and civility back to the House of Commons. And that's another reason I attracted votes from people who traditionally voted Conservative.
Because the party is called Green, I know you've always had to explain that you are also on top of other issues, like a G8 or budgets or healthcare or education.
Yes. Yeah, no, we have a full comprehensive platform. Voters didn't get to hear much about it in the election campaign, unfortunately, and when I was kept out of the debates, that was a real blow for us because it meant we couldn't really get our message out about where we stood on the other issues. But voters in Saanich-Gulf Islands found out, and they really like where we stand on pension reform, on protecting our health care system, of course, on keeping oil tankers off our coast. That's one that everyone would expect us to care about, but that's a big concern, as is the wild salmon fishery. So there are a lot of issues that are traditionally green as in ecological, and then there's a lot of other issues that are about the Green Party being fiscally responsible that attract other voters.
It was interesting for me to watch. I think it happened just recently, the agreement between the boreal forest environmentalists and the corporations, something like 21 corporations and 9 environmental groups came together and found some peace or some kind of agreement in the boreal forest, which could bode well for the future.
Well, I think for almost every, and I'd like to say for every public policy issue, there's a place of agreement that needs to be found. And actually, we launched our campaign urging the other leaders of the other parties to agree with us that there were things on which we could all agree. And I put forward proposals for some consensus ideas that when Parliament resumed, we could all start working on things together, like youth job training. Sadly, that didn't pick up as a theme of trying to get other parties to agree. I think my effort was dismissed by Peter Mansbridge as a kumbaya moment, and then they moved on. But as the Boreal Forest Initiative shows, you can get the Canadian forest producers organizations and environmental groups and First Nations to the same table and say, okay, where do our interests lie here? not arguing positions, but what are our interests? Well, our interests are in sustainability, long-term jobs out of a forest that is renewable, that is well managed, that is sustainable, and we want to protect all those ecosystems. So how do we do that? And I've been involved for a long time in trying to find consensus and solutions that meet everybody's needs, even if they don't actually end up being the position one takes at the beginning. Looking at interests is different. And we could actually, I think, in the House of Commons come to agreement much more often.
Now that would be what Peter Manzer would call your kumbaya
Yeah.
moment, because as we watched what goes on in the House of Commons for so many years, and the fighting and the yelling and the scrapping, now that you have how many newbies, 110?
Yes, 110
new
brand new MPs.
Still have to march to some kind of drummer, so it's a tall order to suggest.
Yeah, I'm hoping, well, for one thing, I can on my own, as the Member of Parliament for Saanich-Gulf Islands in the House of Commons, I think using the rules of procedure, I can end heckling. It's a bold pledge.
That is
my pledge to you.
A very bold pledge. And heckling?
Yeah, now my plan is simple. It's just that it's against the rules of the House of Commons to interrupt someone when they're speaking. It's against the rules of the House of Commons to say things that are derogatory about any other member.
Well, who knew?
Yeah, it's in the rules. Now,
I see.
The Speaker of the House can enforce those rules, but over time, they've kind of let things go, shall we say. Now, we don't know who the new Speaker will be. Peter Milliken was a very impressive Speaker in terms of the decisions he rendered, his knowledge of process and procedure. But my view is, and I've talked to Preston Manning about this and other MPs who tried to end heckling, in a nutshell, they failed because they decided they could end heckling by not heckling themselves. My plan is different. Not only will I not heckle myself, but if I'm being yelled at to the level that I need to raise my voice to be heard, and you know how women sound when we raise our voice to be heard.
I do,
right away.
hysterical.
Yeah, it ramps up the emotion of the whole thing. I will refuse to, I'll just sit down. If I have to yell over noise to ask a question and it violates the rules to be interrupted, I just sit down. Now, the Speaker may ignore the fact I've sat down. It may be that I miss one of my rare chances to ask a question, but I think Canadians will stand up and say, wait a minute, if she's standing on the rules with a policy which I call zero tolerance for heckling, well, we side with her, I hope. And then the other parties will also start doing the same thing, and that's how we'll end heckling, because it's just destructive to the fabric of democracy. It's one of the things I think that's a cue to voters. Then that cue says, I don't want to have anything to do with that. I don't like those people enough to go to the polls and vote on Election Day.
And as you know so well, exchange of smart opinion is a fabulous thing and a good thing, and who doesn't want that? I don't have to agree with you, but please hear me out.
Exactly. And the idea of parliamentary oratory, that would actually get citizens to notice it because it's actually articulate or eloquent or, forgive me, inspiring. How long has it been since anything we've heard on Parliament Hill could be described as articulate or eloquent or inspiring? One thing comes to mind was Stephen Harper's apology to First Nations over residential schools. That hit the mark.
Yes.
But most of it is just scrapping and mud throwing, and that is not acceptable.
Okay, well, we'll be watching to see how that goes.
My plan.
Your plan, a bold plan. Prime Minister Harper at the G8, first time as a majority leader stepping onto the world stage.
Yes, well, I wish that he would listen to some of the other world leaders. I mean, we're being hosted by France. Nicolas Sarkozy has been very forceful on climate issues. Canada has not. Sarkozy has been very forceful on the need for a financial transaction tax to curb the gambling-type behavior of large banks internationally that led to the downfall of 2008. Canada has stood against that. I think we should change our position. It makes sense to curb the avarice and casino-type activities. It wouldn't affect Canadian banks if they're not doing that. So I think we've made a mistake there in policy. So I hope that going into this forum, it will be, and I wish that Canadian media would cover more of what the other world leaders are saying. We tend to go to an event and say, here's our Prime Minister, and we've done wonderfully well, and we come back without a sense of the exchange. What are the other world leaders saying? Where should we be maybe listening a bit more?
Well, they talk about things like creating more stability with Mexico, Canada creating more stability with Mexico. Is that something that comes up at G8? Perhaps, since he has a majority, talk about Latin America or not.
Yeah, but the G8 summit really is looking at traditionally looks at climate issues, looks at economic stability. is increasingly looking at how do we create jobs post-recession. Are we climbing out of the recession? I think we're still very vulnerable, and I don't know if you've seen, did you see the documentary that came out called Inside Job that got the Oscar for Best Documentary? I encourage people to watch it because it really shows, for anybody who doesn't understand complex financial derivatives trading, it explains it so we all get it.
That would be me.
These guys were gambling with other people's money, and that behavior and this isn't Canadian banks, because we regulated Canadian banks, not under the Conservatives, but under the previous Liberals. They were not allowed to go global and merge. Otherwise, they would have done the same risky behavior as the banks of Lehman Brothers and all the financial institutions, gambling with other people's money. And that's what caused the economic collapse. And this documentary is just brilliant at explaining it, but also showing how, guess what, nothing's changed. We're not regulating these guys.
Who did it? Do you remember?
Yeah, the film, it's called The Inside Job.
Inside Job.
It won the Oscar.
Okay, I'll get a copy.
Nothing to do with the Green Party. It's a non-partisan plug.
That's all good. Sanctions against Syria probably
Yes.
will come up, but as you say, it's more
It's
global
macroeconomics.
focus, macroeconomics.
Yeah. And I think it's looking at, it will be looking a lot, it tends to look at security issues as well. And I'm hoping, given where Nicolas Sarkozy in the past has been very forceful, he's declared climate an emergency and a crisis, and he put a carbon tax in effect in France. I don't think that after this year of climate emergency events around the world, we're going to see a French summit where we don't hear about climate.
Four-year mandate for Prime Minister Harper gives him a little more clout, really, to do more what he really wants
it gives
to
him
do.
total. I mean, he had clout in a minority because he was able to run his government as if he had a majority. In this context, with the majority of seats in the House and having stacked the Senate, in a sense, given our system of government, he has unlimited power.
Where do the Greens stand on Senate? Triple E, no Senate at all, elected effective?
Well, yeah.
What? Because those three appointments, as you know, were terribly controversial in that you have three failed political candidates who go back into a patronage appointment, essentially, into the Senate.
What we have to find out when the House resumes, and it's one of my first questions will be, were there any commitments made to the two senators who withdrew that if you don't win your seat, you'll get back into the Senate? Because actually that would be illegal, so it's worth finding out if that
they've
happened.
already said no, from what I've read.
We have to find out. And meanwhile, the Green Party position on the Senate, we'd like to take a basket of issues about the health of our democracy forward as either a royal commission or public inquiry, and talk to Canadians about what we should do. Because yes, maybe we should abolish the Senate. That's going to be hard to do under our Constitution. An elected Senate, should it be proportional representation? Proportional representation actually is even more important in our Commons, because that's how we end up with the minority of the voters. Fewer than 40% of Canadians actually voted for a Conservative candidate, but our system allows them to have the majority of seats. That's happened before. It's not unique to the Harper government. It happened once for Mulroney and once for Chrétien. But false majorities are clearly not in the interest of democracy. You really should have, to get a majority government, you should have the support of the majority of Canadians.
Okay, let's come back and talk about that, how that could happen. You've told me before. Elizabeth May, first elected Green MP in Canada.